Hello and welcome to the Transforming Society podcast from Bristol University Press. My name's George Miller and my guest today is Richard Norman. Richard is Emeritus Professor of Moral Philosophy at the University of Kent, a patron of Humanists UK and a member of Humanist Climate Action. Richard has published widely in the fields of ethics and political philosophy. Richard, welcome to Transforming Society.
Thank you very much for having me.
I wanted to begin today by staring up at the night sky. You refer in the book to Freud's phrase of the oceanic feeling, which I think probably most of us will recognise as sort of feeling of looking up at the immensity of the sky and feeling a certain sense of awe and wonder. Now, a religious person would look at that and would take that as a sort of manifestation of a god, of a deity, perhaps of a creator, and would be inspired to think religious thoughts of mystery and wonder. When a humanist, taking yourself as an example, when a humanist looks at a starry sky, what sort of feelings and thoughts does it provoke?
Yes, that's a very good question, I think. And I think it's interesting that you use the word manifestation there, because a humanist would certainly feel the importance of that experience, but the focus would be on the experience, not the idea that it's somehow leading you to something else, drawing you towards some kind of belief which you need in order to explain it. In a sense, I think the humanist is in a sense in a better position to relish the experience itself for its own sake. Now, of course, there are things one can say about it from a humanist point of view, from a human point of view, that it involves a great sense of peace, a sense of being connected to something larger than oneself, a sense of being able to put into perspective what can seem rather petty preoccupations which tend to divert us from what's important to us. But the emphasis for the humanist would be on the nature of the experience and the difference that it makes by itself to our lives, rather than trying to go beyond it to something else. And in that way, I think it's very emblematic of the difference between humanism and a conventional religious perspective.
And critically, the humanist wouldn't be rejecting that kind of experiential, personal sense of wonder, or it wouldn't be they wouldn't be standing there, contemplating it in a sort of scientific sense and thinking about these, gases and distances and astral bodies, which I think is quite an important distinction to make.
It is. And, of course, the science is important. In a way, the science adds to the sense of wonder. I mean, when we look up at the night sky, we no longer think, well, it's, quite a lot, a few thousand miles away. What we're seeing is something immense, something that defies all our common sense expectations. We're looking at billions of stars and billions of galaxies which have existed for billions of years. And that in itself is awe-inspiring, and the science, in a way, adds to the awe. But it adds to it. It doesn't create the awe. The awe just comes from our sense of both in a way our insignificance when confronted with the vastness of the universe, but also our sense of connection with it, a sense that we are part of this magnificent universe.
Yeah. Now, when I was planning this series, I made lots of lists of potential titles, and the lists were very much longer than the series will ever be, because there's so many possible titles you could put in it. And on an early list, I think I probably wrote down the word atheism, and I think I probably wrote that down because I remember, 20 odd years ago, there was this vogue for new atheism, this sort of Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins kind of approach, where atheism did really seem to be instrumentalized. It did seem to have a purpose, and its purpose seemed to be to take down religion. It wasn't simply setting out a set of beliefs or assumptions or conclusions about the world and our place in the world. It actually seemed to have a project. And I felt, for a variety of reasons, one of which that wave seems to have passed, and also that it seemed to be overwhelmingly negative and really not to make a good, to give a good account of itself. And it seemed to me that humanism was much richer and more interesting and positive, if I can put it as straightforwardly as that, way to approach perhaps a similar kind of set, or an interlocking or an overlapping set of questions. Do you think that I made the right decision? And can you see where I'm coming from?
I think you've made exactly the right decision. And I think you've put your finger on it in a sense. I think you've left me with nothing to say. I think that's absolutely the difference. Atheism is not something you can live by. Humanism is. If you ask what is atheism for, well, I suppose you could say it's for getting at the truth, getting to an understanding of how things are, and that's a crucially important exercise, of course. And I wouldn't want to knock that vogue for what was people called the new atheism, though it wasn't new at all. It was just a restatement of ideas that have been around since the European Enlightenment. So it had an interesting impact. It reawakened the debate, which I think was very valuable. But the debate needs to go beyond just the negative. The debate needs to engage with the perfectly legitimate question. Well, if there is no God, what do we live for? What are our lives about? What gives value to our lives? How do we make sense of the world around us? And that's what humanism is for, to address those questions.
Yes, and I guess the new atheist perspective saw the world in very binary terms, and I get the impression that humanism is perhaps more open to agnosticism and to nuance and perhaps doubt than the card-carrying atheists would be.
I think so, yes. I mean, humanists come in all shapes and sizes, and some will see the world in more binary terms than others. I'm very much on the non-binary extreme. So, I think that people's beliefs and values are incredibly complex, and that includes religious people. I'm very interested in dialogue with religious people, very actively engaged in. Actually, I've another book that I'm co-editing, and which is actually going to be published the day before What Is Humanism For, which is rather nice, is an edited collection called Religion and Atheism in Dialogue, which is exactly what it says. It's engaging in dialogue with thoughtful religious people to look at what we have in common, what beliefs we share, what common ground there is, what the nature of our differences is, how we can try to make sense of those differences and perhaps go some way to understanding them better. So I'm very much on the complexity end of the relationship between religion and non-religion. But yes, I think it's important to do justice to that and not set up a simple binary, as you say.
Yeah. Now, one thing we didn't talk about when we were working on this book, and which I'm curious about, is your own intellectual path, your own spiritual path.
Yes.
to humanism. And I wondered, could you take us back to your childhood and tell us, what kind of, did you have a religious upbringing? How did you end up where you are today, as it were?
Well, yes, I did indeed. That's an interesting story. And actually, this is a story that I tell when I go to talk about humanism. I get a lot of invitations these days to go into schools to talk about humanism. I'm a humanist school speaker, and latterly those invitations have been very much focused on primary schools, and that's a wonderful opportunity to tell my own story. And of course, at that age, the kids are keen to know about you as a person. And for the first 20 years of my life, really, I was a Christian. My grandparents, one of my grandparents was a Baptist, so I went along to the Baptist church and Baptist Sunday school for 10 years. And when we moved house, I went along to the Methodist church where my great aunts were mainstays of the local Methodist church. And I continued going there regularly every Sunday for another pretty much 10 years or so. And it was a hugely important part of my life. And one that was in many ways a very positive part of my life. It got me thinking about beliefs and values. It got me thinking about the nature of the world and so forth. It was intellectually stimulating. Uh, it wasn't a narrow version of Christianity. It was one that very much encouraged me to think, and I did. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought, I'm not sure that I can make sense of this. One of the things that I say to kids when I go into schools is I used to every night kneel down by my bed and say my prayers, and increasingly I thought, what am I doing here? As I became more conscious and began to raise questions more. And that didn't lead to an immediate change of perspective. It just led me to try to think it through in a more thorough, more satisfactory way. The attempt to think it through coincided with some quite important changes that were going on within the Christian churches. It was the time of the publication of the book Honest to God, which some people may remember, by Bishop John Robinson, which caused a great furore because it set out to question very naive views about the nature of religion, the idea of God as a sort of super person who was looking after you, and tried to put Christian belief into more intellectually sustainable form. So I was very excited by that. But in the upshot of my engagement with all that thinking was to think, actually, the very idea of a deity in the end can't be articulated in a coherent way. But I think also I took with me very much the values, the important values that I'd learned from my Christian upbringing, because, as I say, it was a very open, liberal version of Christianity. So the virtues of compassion, the importance of justice, of social justice, which my Methodist family was very strongly committed to. So in some ways it was a positive experience. It's always, of course, um, um, a struggle to leave behind not only a set of beliefs, but also a community in which those beliefs were embedded, and which was very much a part of my life. So it wasn't an easy transition to make, but much easier, of course, it has to be said, than that transition for a great many people who are sometimes under huge pressure to stay with a religious community, which they have come to find extremely constricting, and very difficult to live with, but also very difficult to leave. But that was my history.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. It's left me wondering, as you began to lose this framework for your beliefs and your values, were you simultaneously beginning to seek another framework in philosophy and in science? I mean, were you sort of questing for something else which would sort of undergird and frame those beliefs?
In philosophy, yes. I mean, just to be personal about this, this also coincided with, the culmination of this was when I went to university. I had to decide what I was going to study at university, and I went up to university to study classics, ancient Latin and Greek literature and history. And in my first year at university, I increasingly felt uncomfortable with that, mainly because I didn't have a flair for the language, which is crucial for studying that degree. Because I was so very much preoccupied with thinking about religious issues, initially I thought, I'll change to theology. I talked to the dean, who said, well, take your time, think it through properly. And by the end of the year, I knew what I wanted to change to was philosophy. And that's what I did. And of course, as you intimate, that fitted in perfectly with the intellectual activity that I was going through. Actually, at first I was rather disappointed in philosophy, because this was the heyday of linguistic philosophy, when so much of it seemed to be about rather trivial questions about the meanings of words. And I got a bit impatient with philosophy as well. I said to my philosophy tutor, what about the big questions like the existence of God? And he said, well, we can talk about those as well. Yes.
Yeah.
But yes, it was very much part of um, that whole process of change. And what I also learned, of course, from studying philosophy is that there are no easy answers. What's just as important as the answers is the process of trying to look for it, the process of rational inquiry, of coherent logical thought, trying to get clear about things. And so, yes, that's really shaped my life since.
Yeah. And you mentioned classics, and from the book, it's clear that the questions that humanists are asking today have much in common with what some ancient Greeks were asking over 2,000 years ago.
Absolutely.
There's the same impulses there, and is it fair to see that ancient Greek tradition as one of the well springs for contemporary humanism, or is that stretching too far?
Absolutely. One of the temptations when I write about humanism is to go on and on about the Greeks, and that's something that I had to cut down for this book as well. Like I would love to write a book just about the ancient Greek origins of humanism. Um, it's in around the 7th century BCE. You get these questions. As this wonderful thinker Xenophanes, about whom we know very little, but he said, well, if horses had gods, they'd think they were like horses, and if cows had gods, they'd think that their gods were cows. And the Ethiopians think that their gods are snub-nosed, and the Thracians say that their gods have red hair. What he was saying is, we create these gods in our own image rather than being made in the image of God. And that's what's amazing about that is not just the actual points that he made, but that he was somebody, he represents that willingness to thoroughly question beliefs which were simply accepted as normal within his society. And that impulse for questioning, I think, is absolutely crucial. And that is very much part of the intellectual tradition that goes back to the ancient Greeks. Socrates, of course, a classic example. Socrates always asking questions. In the end, the Athenians got so fed up with him, they put him to death, which was a bit extreme, I think. But that whole tradition of questioning received beliefs, thinking through the evidence, thinking through what you can coherently say. That's very much a tradition that goes back. One of the reasons why it's important not just to pin it on the Greeks, I think, is that increasingly humanists become aware of how, within other cultures in other parts of the world, you find that same exercise going on. If you look at ancient Indian thought, you find very much the same sorts of questions being raised there at about the same sort of time. And we don't know to what extent there was interchange and influence between the two. But yes, the same kind of thinking has gone on in other cultures as well. And it's important to draw on that more global history as well.
Yeah. So there are certain impulses in common that we see in different parts of the world at different
Yes, and there are
times.
huge, very difficult questions to raise about, why it is at certain times in history that people, start raising those questions and thinking outside the box, thinking outside their own culture.
Yeah. I realize I'm skipping through millennia here, but when does it become possible to begin to put forward ideas which seriously question Christianity? Because that seemed to me another. If ancient Greece is one important reference point, it seemed to me that when it actually became, however dangerous, it became possible to actually erect some kind of argument that rejected Christianity. That's a
Yes, I mean,
significant.
I suppose it's really, um, of course, it's a slow process. It becomes really, possible in the early 19th century, I think. You've got the period of very radical thinking going on across Europe in the 18th century, what we call the Enlightenment, but it was still very dangerous to say, well, I'm an atheist. Hume, the great philosopher David Hume, publishes wonderful dialogues on natural religion. He made sure that it wasn't published in his lifetime, and he wrote it in dialogue form, so that none of the characters actually came out as an atheist. But Hume was a master of irony and of subtle writing. And it's very clear when you read the Dialogues of Natural Religion, it's very clear what the message is, that actually no version of Orthodox Christian belief can be rationally and philosophically defended. But he couldn't come out and say that. And another very influential thinker contemporary with Hume, Baron Dolbach, who was German but was part of the Salon in Paris. Um, uh, there's a story of Hume visiting him and saying, "Well, I've never actually met a fully fledged atheist." And Holbach said, "Well, I think there are 11 in this room." But Holbach couldn't actually, again, publish his own writing explicitly saying this is a defense of atheism. He published pseudonymously, and he was very careful about using the word atheism. Another landmark example is that the poet Shelley, when he was at Oxford University as a student, he and a friend of his produced a book, again anonymously, called The Necessity of Atheism. And a few copies were sold. As a result, Shelley was chucked out of Oxford University with his friend Hogg. So even then, that was just the first decade. I can't remember the exact year, but the first decade of the 19th century. It was still very dangerous to call yourself an atheist. But what's fascinating is over the period of the 19th century in European cultures and in the United States, of course, gradually people became more and more explicit about religious doubts. It became more and more of a wider cultural phenomenon, the so-called crisis of faith, that's epitomized in Matthew Arnold's famous poem Dover Beach, when he talks about the sea of faith now once was at its full, but now it's receding. And I think that was very much a sense that a lot of people had in the 19th century, this crisis of faith, that really we had to think this through. And again, of course, it's something that people really struggled with. And what's impressive is the way in which in the 19th century you began to get these new institutions and organizations coming into existence, the so-called ethical societies, for example, the forerunners of the modern humanist movement, in which people really try to think through what it is in a positive way they believe, if they can no longer rely on the old traditional religious dogmas.
Yeah. So it's in the latter part of the 19th century that we see humanism in a sense that we would recognize it today, beginning to come together, beginning to think not just about the loss of religious belief, but about what might replace it in worldview and ethical terms. Because humanism, of course, has been used at various periods of history to mean quite different things, hasn't it?
Yes, that's right. And I mean, the original use of the word humanism in the European languages and Latin languages was to refer to the Renaissance humanists, the scholars who discovered after the fall of Constantinople, in particular, all these classics of Latin and Greek became more available in Western Europe, and scholars who studied these, and they were called humanists because they were reviving this interest in the literature and the culture that focused on the humanities, on what it is to be human, and of course initially within a religious context. But that was the original use of the word humanism. And then the use of the word gradually changed. It's only quite recently, actually, only into the last century, well into the 20th century, that people we'd now call humanists started using that word. There are all sorts of other words that people use: secularists, rationalists, free thinkers, skeptics, and so on. And it took a long time, and of course, as I said, the ethical societies. That was the preferred phrase for a long time. What is now Humanists UK was originally the Ethical Union. For a long time, it had that name, and then only in the 1950s, I think, it actually adopted the name the British Humanist Association, and then more recently, that was changed to the rather more trendy Humanists UK.
Yeah.
So
So,
yeah, the movement has a longer history than the word.
yeah. So you dispense with the religious framework. You reject the appeal to some supernatural creator god. What then provides the ethical foundations, and how is that arrived at? Because I guess that's kind of central question, isn't it? So
Yes,
if you
yes.
lose that structure that religion provides, which makes everything, well, let's say reasonably clear and explains why you should be doing certain things, if you reject that, then do you build from the ground up, and if so, on what floor plan?
Well, you do build from the ground up. You build from what we are. I mean, my simple answer would be you look at our shared humanity and the nature of our shared humanity and why that gives to rise to values which we share. That there are shared human needs, which we all have, not only biological needs, but also needs, the needs that we have in order to flourish, the need for community, the need for a sense of achievement in our lives, the need to think for ourselves, to feel that we're making a difference in the world, to make sense of our lives as something specific to us as individuals. And the need for community is crucially important there, because living in human beings are social beings, are social animals, as Aristotle famously said. And to live in a community is to live by its very nature in a network of values, a network of shared values. Any community is impossible without shared values. So at a very basic, very general level, although of course, in at some level, cultures and communities vary hugely in the way that they live and in the values that they have. At a more fundamental value, any human community needs to recognize some version of the value of justice, for example. To cooperate, we need some agreed notion of how we share out tasks, how we share out the benefits of cooperation. And of course, there are all sorts of ways in which that can be articulated, but some notion of justice, of fairness is built into human affairs and human cooperation. Some notion of honesty, fundamental to any human community, is the use of a shared language. And that whole realm of activity would be impossible without some norm of honesty. The presumption that when people talk to one another, the default position is to assume that they're attempting to tell one another the truth. Now, of course, that's no guarantee that people always will do, but some concept of honesty, of using language in order to convey what you really think, is built into the whole exercise of the use of language. Some value of loyalty. We exist within communities large and small, where we have responsibilities to one another, where we share our lives, and therefore where we have obligations of loyalty to one another. They're built into the very idea of a family, a friendship, and so forth. And all these values, underpinning them all, is the value of kindness and compassion, the recognition of our shared humanity, the recognition of our shared experiences of happiness and sadness, and our fundamental, deeply human capacity for empathy, for sharing other people's feelings, entering into other people's lives. Now, all of these things, of course, are no guarantee that people live by these values, but that's where we need to look to understand why those values are fundamental to what it is to be human, and why some version of those values is found in any human community. And that's where we would start. That's when your phrase "from the ground up" that's the ground one would start from.
Yeah. And so, can you talk a little bit about how, equipped with those set of values, how that enables you to begin to address the title question of your book, What Humanism Is For? So you've got this sort of ethical framework. You've rejected religion. So from that point, is it about navigating daily life? Is it about finding meaning? Is it about purpose? How does that sort of basic foundation then begin to help us with the
But it's
purpose of.
partly about navigating daily life, and of course, that's what, a lot of the time we navigate daily life with those sorts of values without having to think about
Yeah.
them. They come naturally to us. Sometimes they don't. That's the
Yeah.
problem of human life. But a lot of the time in our day-to-day interactions with other people, we just implicitly um, respond to other people on the basis of values of that kind. But also, then they provide the starting point for thinking about more controversial ethical issues. I'm going to take an example, if I may, that's very pertinent today because in the House of Commons today, members of Parliament are debating the assisted dying bill. Um, about whether the law should change in such a way as to make it possible to help terminally ill people who want help with ending their lives because they're at the end of their lives and they're in terrible pain and they just simply don't want to go on longer and they want help in ending their suffering. And that's become a hugely controversial issue. And in many ways, a very divisive one. People have very strong views. Some people think, yeah, it's absolutely vital that the law should be changed. And other people think, no, that would be a terrible move. Uh, Although it's so divisive, I think as a humanist, I would want to say it's important to look at um, the capacities for rational dialogue about it. And that's where what I was saying about these fundamental values comes into play. Whatever we think about the issue of assisted dying, most people would say we share the importance of the value of compassion. Then we have to think through the difficult question, well, what does compassion actually mean in this situation? Some people, the opponents of legalizing assisted dying, will say, well, how can you try to bring about, promote the death of someone, human being? Surely compassion should always lead you to want to preserve human life. And then other people would say, well, yes, of course, fundamental to compassion normally in most circumstances would be to want to help people, to keep them out of danger, to help them to go on living. But there are extreme circumstances in which the value of compassion might point the other way. And we have to recognize the complexity. We have to recognize that people who are dying in terrible agony, in huge indignity, who desperately ask for help, that the compassionate response to them might actually be to help them to put an end to their suffering. But the important point there is scope for rational debate and dialogue on matters like that, precisely because we do have a shared language of values within which we can try to articulate what our differences are and how we can think them through. So that's an important feature then of the humanist approach to values. And we don't get our answers from a sacred text or a religious institution which tells us, well, if you're a real Christian, if you're a real Muslim, if you're a real Jew or Hindu or whatever, this is your answer and that is what you have to go by, which is actually can be a very divisive way of looking at these controversial moral and ethical issues. What the humanists would say is we need to look at these fundamental human values which we share because we are human and look at what they actually mean in this particular context in the light of all the facts. I mean, the crucial recognition of the facts is crucially important here, including the science. You look at what the circumstances actually are. So if I may just stick with the assisted dying example, one of the issues here, of course, is whether the legalizing assisted dying could be misused to put undue pressure on people to ask for help in ending their lives when they didn't really want it. And so an important part of that debate, again, is looking at the evidence, looking at what has happened in other jurisdictions where assisted dying has been legalized, look at what safeguards can be put in place, look at institutionally how they might work, how they might be problematic. So an important part of the debate is also getting at the facts. And again, humanists would say that's absolutely essential. We need to do our research. We need to find out what the social and scientific and biological and medical facts really are. That's why it's a hugely complex question, but it's one about which there can be informed moral debate and which there can be intelligent moral dialogue, because we can share the task of trying to get clear about the facts, and we can share the values that we start out from in trying to arrive at thoughtful solutions to the issue.
Yeah. Richard, you spoke earlier about the importance of community to all of us as human beings, and religions have been very good at sort of finding ways to express that desire for community and ceremony and ritual and togetherness and sharing. And just to stay on a somber subject, I wanted to ask about a humanist funeral, because that's probably where religion, if I can put it in these terms, does most work in terms of consolation and, offering this promise of the beyond and something more than our human life and our human limitations. And it struck me that that's probably quite a, maybe one of the hardest tests for humanism to pass, not in intellectual terms, but in terms of feeding our sort of human needs. So how does a humanist funeral respond to that?
That's a good question. And as it happens, I went to the humanist funeral of a friend last week, and it was conducted by the humanist celebrant, of whom there is actually a picture in the book, my friend Sue Baumbach. And as always with the humanist funeral, what it does is to focus on the person to whom we're saying goodbye, the person whom we will miss, focusing on the nature of that person's life, telling stories about that person's life, sometimes funny stories, but stories, of course, tinged with sadness, with great grief often about them. The person that we've lost at this particular funeral, the daughter of the person who died, spoke, and her contribution was a mixture of laughter and tears, in a way which really sums up a humanist funeral. She was, telling funny stories about her mum, and broke down in tears at one point, literally, and that epitomizes really the nature of a humanist funeral as an occasion in which we share our grief at the sometimes terrible loss that we've experienced, but at the same time, we recognize that the person for whom we're grieving is lived a life well lived, a rich life, a full life, hopefully, and that the memories of that life will stay with us. That person will stay with us through those memories. These are not uniquely human responses to a death, of course. Uniquely humanist. Yeah. They are classically human responses that we all share. And again, it's typical of humanism that it focuses on those. It focuses on our common human responses and human experiences, rather than what humanists would see as understandable, but in the end, illusory expectations of another future life.
Richard, as we draw to a close, I don't want to talk about all the objections to humanism, because you're very honest in the book and you deal with several of them, and I think people will be interested to see what you have to say about some of those objections. But I just wanted to maybe pick out one or two things, and one of them is you could say that, well, you might say this is a sort of distortion of what humanism is, but we're doing an incredible amount of damage to the planet.
Yes.
We're perhaps careering towards some sort of existential crisis. And you could say that by putting the human at the center, in fact, not living by true religious tenets, but actually being very much about the material, the human, our needs, our wants, and expressing those and fulfilling our desires, we've sort of brought ourselves to this. Yes. Terrible situation. And actually what we should be doing in the Anthropocene is actually trying to, in some way, decenter the human rather than focus on, our material human reality. Yes. What do humanists, and as I say, I recognize that's probably something of a distortion of humanism, but it's probably not an objection you haven't heard before. What would you say to it?
It's a very good case, and it's something I feel very strongly about. I'm a a member of a group which is a section of Humanist UK, which is called Humanist Climate Action. I'm very involved in that. I produce a newsletter for it and so forth. And part of the purpose of that is to just emphasize to our fellow humanists the importance of taking action on the environmental crisis. That's not something new. That has a long history. One of the early presidents of I think it was the first president of the British Humanist Association, the great biologist Julian Huxley, was one of the pioneers of, back in the 1950s, of taking action on the environmental crisis. It foresaw the need for this much more than most people at the time. So that's something crucially important. Now, the questions that you raise there, again, are crucial ones, but I think it's important to pin down what we mean by the phrase human-centered. Human beings have been human-centered in their attitude to the environment, in the sense that they've been short-sighted in their preoccupation with the ways in which, technically and scientifically, we can simply use the natural world as a resource. And part of the problem, as I say, is that they've thought human beings have thought in a very short term way about that. Most human beings, not all, but most human beings have failed to think ahead to what we're actually doing to the natural world, which we're making use of through the whole process of industrialization, of course, ravaged the natural world in all sorts of obvious ways. There were always people speaking out against it, people like William Morris at the end of the 19th century saying, what are we doing to our world? What is capitalism doing in creating terrible smoke-filled cities in which are a degradation of human life as well as a degradation of the natural world. But the answer to that is not to stop thinking about the impact on human beings, but to think in a more adequate way about what we are doing to ourselves, how we're destroying the world from which we gain so much sustenance, not just materially, but also emotionally, in giving meaning to our lives. It takes us back to the night sky example. That if you can't see the night sky for the smog, then you're diminishing your own life. And of course, there's much more to it than that. An important part of what gives meaning and purpose to human life for humanists is recognizing that we're a part of the natural world which we share with other living things. The wonder of the life of other living things, which is with which we share life on this planet, but which are so different from us in a myriad ways which enrich our lives. So thinking in human terms, if you like, but in a much much deeper way about what the natural world means to us as human beings, and thinking also, of course, on what we're doing to other living things in the ways in which we affect their lives as well. So, of course, the environmental crisis also extends to thinking in a responsible way about modern agriculture, modern farming techniques, the way in which animals are kept in terrible conditions sometimes. That matters not just because of its effect on human beings, but because it's of its effect on other sentient beings as well. Keeping pigs reared in cages where they simply can't move and can't live their normal piggy life is a terrible wrong done to the animals as well as to ourselves in terms of the quality of the food that we eat and so forth. So yes, crucially important humanist issues which raise the question of what we mean by being human-centered and prompt us to think about how that notion should not be understood in purely narrow terms. In a sense, we have to be human-centered because we are humans. We have to think about what difference all these things make to our lives. But we have to think about the differences they make to our lives by seeing ourselves as something larger than simply our own narrow individual lives. That we are part of a larger society. We're part of an ongoing human history, and we have to think about what kind of world we are creating for those who will come afterwards, our children and our grandchildren and future generations, and thinking about the impact that we're having on the natural world itself. So it's a good example that raises some good issues about the nature of humanism and in what way it's human-centered.
Yeah. And I guess another challenge to us as humans, I was thinking this morning, having invented God and then having rejected God, we're now at a stage in our development where we're trying to create artificial superintelligence. And it may never happen, and if it does happen, it may be a long way off. But serious people are spending a lot of money and talking about it as a potential to create something which is more rational, more all-seeing, more all-knowing than any human being has ever been by orders of magnitude. And that must be, well, it's a profound challenge, even as a thought experiment for us all. So what do humanists think about this possible brave new world where we're no longer the most rational creature
Yes.
on the planet?
Yes. I'm no expert on AI, and I have to be very cautious about treading into this. At the same time, I think my impression is that there's a lot of wild thinking and fantasy in some of the things that people write and say about this. I think though I'm no expert at all, I mean, I think the crucially important thing to keep in mind is what we're talking about is new techniques that human beings are created. And the crucial question is what, as human beings, we're going to do with those things. AI has huge potential for increasing our knowledge base, for example, for enabling human beings to process data and acquire information of a kind that would be, has traditionally been extremely difficult to arrive at and extremely time-consuming. So it creates a lot of potential for improving human thinking, promoting human progress in the sense of giving us better control over how we do things and what we do. But we have to stop thinking about this as something that will take us over. The proper way to think about it is to think about responsible use of it, how it can enable us to do new things, how it can also give huge power to some human beings over others, and the dangers of that, looking at the political dangers, the social dangers of it. Again, I'm no expert on this, but the influence of social media for good and for ill is a classic issue here. People sometimes talk about transhumanism as the emergence of a world which will go beyond the human altogether, and in which current scientific developments will lead to the existence of completely new beings with maybe cyborgs or whatever with a completely different biological basis and so forth. The important serious questions are the questions about what difference these things make to human lives, to the human responsibilities, to the ways in which we use this new technology as human beings. And it's that focus, I think, that again is part of what you were referring to earlier as bringing things down to earth, starting from where we really are, starting from the values that we have now, and thinking about how we use this technology in responsible ways.
So just to finish, Richard, if people are curious about humanism, having listened to this, a very good place to go next is, of course, your book. And then beyond that, out in the world, are people likely to then be able to find ways to connect with other humanists? Is that easy to do? Should they? I imagine some people might be curious, but maybe a little bit trepidatious about, like going to a new church. So, once they've read your book, what should they do next if they're still curious?
Well, you
to
mentioned
find out more?
humanist ceremonies, and these are ways in which a lot of people first come across humanism for the first time. Humanist funerals, also humanist weddings. humanist weddings are becoming increasingly popular. They're now legally recognised in Scotland, though not in England. So the number of humanist weddings in Scotland has shot up, and one of the things that we're pushing for is for them to be legally recognised in England and Wales as well. But that's a very specific way in which people come across humanism. But I've talked about Humanist UK as an organisation, and the Humanist UK has lots of resources about the nature of humanism and how you can find out more about it. Um, um, Very good section of its website called Understanding Humanism, which is partly for use by school teachers and for use in schools and colleges for finding out more about it, but it's accessible to anyone, so you can just Google Understanding Humanism, and there's a lot of resources there. There are humanist groups or humanist organizations. Our annual convention of the Humanists UK will be happening in Sheffield next month. So though as humanists, we don't try to replicate the structure of other religious institutions and churches and so forth. There are humanist groups that people can get in touch with, and this is where we come back to the new technology by going onto the web and looking at what's around there. People can find out ways of getting in touch with humanism and humanist groups and other people who call themselves humanists. But there are a lot of ways of doing it, and reading the book will be a good start as well. And there are some suggestions at the end of that as to how you can find out more.
Yeah. Richard, thank you very much for talking to us on the podcast.
Thank you very much for a very interesting conversation.